today, it's increasingly important to look back at this point in history to understand exactly what happened and the parallels it has to today. This special episode will be split into 3 parts.
5, 6,
I'll take you through the setup of the disaster,
11,
then the crash,
14,
then the death
15,
of
16,
the real economy,
19,
finish with
20,
what you can do to help yourself.
1,
Let's begin the story
1,
of one of
2,
the biggest
3,
events
4,
in human
5,
history.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7,
Get the
8,
full picture.
9, 10,
We need to go back to America in
14,
1995.
15, 16,
During this year, the fight was on to help low-income
3,
people. The US government passed laws to decrease discrimination against poorer home borrowers. The banks would lower lending requirements, offering packages such as reduced payments for a number of years. Soon after, in 1999, the US government repealed a law that stopped commercial banks from taking part in investment banking activities. The law that they got rid of was the Glass-Steagall Act. Ironically, this law was made in 1933 to stop the speculation that fueled the Great Depression. It was a fatal mistake.
10, 12,
From 1999 onwards, banks which had previously managed conservatively turned to riskier and riskier investments, as well as speculation, all in an effort to increase their returns. Banks cared less about their customers and more about Wall Street profits.
2, 3, 4,
According to Nobel economics laureate Joseph Stiglitz, this move played a major role in the financial collapse that was to come. But why worry? Right now, things were good.
3, 4,
It was the late
6,
1990s,
7,
and
8,
there were seemingly no economic problems in sight for America. The internet had taken over the minds of everyone. Investment banks were throwing money behind anything that had a .com at the end. The result was the launch of stupid companies like Pets.com. The banks didn't care though. When the stock went up, they would sell and make their profit. This was the .com bubble, and it had arrived in full force. People quit their jobs to trade stocks, and shares went crazy. For example, shares of Qualcomm rose by 2,619% in 1999 alone. In America, there was money to be made, and life was good. But something started to happen. Soon investors realized that these internet companies had no cash flow and couldn't actually make any money. And by March 2000, it all came crashing down.
15, 14,
The next year, the September 11th attacks would occur, followed by the Enron and WorldCom corporate accounting scandals. After these events, the public and the markets lost trust in the economy. Spending trended downward, and it was looking like the economy was heading for a recession.
1,
To avoid this, the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, decided to lower interest rates down to 1%.
1, 2, 3,
The low interest rates would increase spending and recover confidence in the American economy. With a low 1% interest rate and no systemic problems in the real economy, the recovery was rapid and economic growth was ample.
1, 2,
Eventually, speculation started to migrate from stocks into real estate.
1,
By 2003, everyone with a good credit score and a good job already owned a home. If you were in the business of giving out home loans, this was a bad sign. To save their profit margins, mortgage lenders relaxed credit scores to get more people in the door and increase profits. These were called subprime loans. As the money flowed in and time went on, the lending standards got lower and lower and lower. Soon there were mortgage deals that required no income, no job, and no assets.
They stopped checking whether the income was even real. They turned to low and no doc loans, so-called liar's loans. No income, no job, no assets, and they were still willing to lend.
But help me out here. How does that make sense for the lender? It
Yeah.
would seem to be reckless in the extreme.
It was, but the key assumption was that home prices would keep going up forever. And in fact, home prices nationwide had never declined since the Great Depression.
People like acupuncturist Rula Giosmas became real estate speculators.
How many properties did you buy in this last 5-year period?
I believe in the last 5-year period I bought about 6 properties
And what did you buy them for?
for investments.
If a subprime customer defaulted, it was no problem. Just sell the house because it was going to go up in value. Whoever can still make a profit.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12,
So this next part is a bit in the weeds. And I need you to bear with me because it's crucial to the story.
1,
So Wall Street is looking at the situation, and they saw an opportunity.
10,
You see,
11,
there were
12,
two groups of people that could be linked here. On the one side, were the mortgage lenders, who were profiting from a newly found
1,
market.
2, 3,
They wanted
4,
to get rid of
5,
these risky
6,
loans
7,
because
8,
they knew
9,
that these
10,
loans would jump
12,
and had a huge
3,
liability.
7,
On the other hand, you had institutional investors who were
3.
looking for ways to increase their returns. Since interest rates were low at 1%, high-yield products were off the table. The Wall Street banks had an idea, and they got to work offering the perfect high-yielding product, the mortgage-backed security. These were a bundle of individual mortgage shares sold as shares.
4,
These shares would give back the investors who bought them a safe, fixed income. So while the previous bankers realized that they could use an old financial tool in
2,
combination
3,
with mortgage-backed
5,
securities
6, 7,
unimaginable amounts of money. If they used this tool in
7,
housing,
8.
they could make tens of billions of
Two.
dollars in just months. This
Oh,
tool
God.
was the CDO, collateralized debt obligation. To give you an idea of how lovely these products were, the bank that invented them went bankrupt due to a massive insider trading scandal. One way to imagine a CDO product is to think of it as a box. This box gets filled with monthly repayments from a group of mortgages and other debt, such as car loans and student loans. The box can generate income to investors who buy it. It's divided into different levels. Each level represents a different risk.
A CDO works like three cascading trades. As money comes in, the top trade goes
1,
first.
2,
Goods
3,
goes
4,
over
5,
into
6,
the
7, 8,
and whatever
9,
is left
10,
over the
1,
bank.
2, 3,
The money
4,
comes from homeowners
7,
paying off
8,
their mortgages.
10, 1.
Some owners don't pay and default on
It's
the mortgage. Less
6.
comes in, and the bottom trade may not get filled. This makes the bottom trade riskier, and the top trade safer. To compensate for the higher risk, the bottom trade receives a higher rate of return, while the top receives a lower, but still nice return.
The aim of this was to diversify the risk, but there was a fatal flaw. Since the blocks had safe prime home loans mixed in with loans to people who had no job, the whole thing was risky. All of the risk was passed to investors who purchased these debt boxes. Meanwhile, the lenders and the banks profited handsomely by charging high fees.
This system is a tricky time. Lenders
Two.
couldn't pay lenders without how their borrowers could repay, so they started making risky loans.
3,
The investment banks couldn't pay lenders. The more CDOs they sold,
1.
the higher their profits.
As the financial assets became more complex
2.
and harder to value, the majority didn't understand how these instruments work. They
3,
turned to credit rating agencies for clarity. The hope was that these institutions could do their homework for them and determine risk correctly. So
2.
as it goes, the rating agencies completely screwed up. They
3.
rated these debt boxes as AAA, the highest possible rating. This signaled that they were extremely safe, good enough for pension funds and the wider economy to invest in. But there's a question remaining. Why did the rating agencies rate these debt boxes as high quality? Well, sadly, it was because the rating agencies made billions of dollars in doing so. If a bank came to them asking to rate their box filled with junk, a rating agency would know that if they gave the product the true junk rating, the banks would just go to another rating agency down the road to get the AAA rating they desired. Rating all of these boxes AAA meant that the money kept flowing into the rating agencies. This was another key component to the disaster. These false ratings would later spread America's problems to the rest of the world. Between 2000 and 2007, the subprime mortgage debt included in the packages increased from 5% to 36%. They saw remarkable success, growing from an estimated $20 billion in 2004 to over $180 billion in 2007. Bankers were personally making millions to tens of millions in bonuses. While this was going on, there were some mad scientists in the financial industry that were creating financial weapons of mass destruction. This is where things go insane, and the greed was in full swing. The final stage of the greed was the invention of the mortgage credit default swap. This was a financial instrument that worked as insurance against failed mortgage debt products.
1, 2, 3, 4,
So it's an
6, 7,
insurance.
8, 9, 10.
It is an insurance contract, but they've been very careful not to call it that.
1, 2, 3, 4,
Because if it were
5,
insurance,
6, 7,
it would
8,
be rated.
9, 10.
This is actually the security. This is the selling document for the security. Did anybody ever read this stuff?
1,
I
2,
definitely
3,
did.
5,
These complex financial instruments were actually designed by mathematicians and physicists who used algorithms and computer models to constitute the unreliable loans in ways that were supposed to eliminate most of the risk.
Obviously, they turned out to be wrong.
Why?
Because you can't model human behavior with math.
There are complex, in effect, mortgage science projects devised by these Nobel-track physicists who came to work on Wall Street.
And it didn't stop Wall Street from making billions selling them to banks, pension funds, and other institutional investors all over the world.
How big is the market for credit default swaps? We really don't know. There's this voluntary survey that claims that the market is in the range of 50 to 60 or so $trillion. It's sort of alarming that in a market that big, we don't even know how big it is.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,
This
11,
enables
12,
banks to bet on the direction of the mortgage price.
18,
If they guess right,
What?
they'll make a bunch of money.
1, 2, 3,
For a moment, it's a
5,
football
6,
game. People in the stands might also have a financial stake in the outcome, in the
7,
form of a bet with a friend or a bookie.
The
Two.
insight that arose over the last several years was that based on whether people were default on their mortgage.
And that was the bet that blew up Wall Street.
And crazier still, banks could bet on the outcome of the previous bet, and banks could bet on the bet of that bet. Because these are swaps, and technically not insurance, the banks didn't need any cash to back up their bets if they
1,
go
2,
down. What could possibly go wrong?
And recently illegal. It was very illegal 100 years ago. Because it brought down the market in 1907. And so we're not going to let this happen
6.
again. And then 100 years later,
Oh.
in 2000, we rolled them all back.
In retrospect, giving Wall Street immunity from state gambling laws and legalizing activity that had been banned for most of the 20th century should have given lawmakers pause.
If it sounds meaningless, it basically is. These products created no value in the economy, but were making banks a whole bunch of money. Insurance companies, such as AIG, saw their profits soar.
1,
Financial engineering was running rampant, and there was no one supervising any of these products. In October 2004, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, bizarrely relaxed the liquidity requirements of 5 banks: Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Morgan Stanley. This lit the fire.
1,
The more the banks borrow, the higher their leverage.
2,
The SEC somehow
3.
decided to let investment banks gamble a lot more. That was nuts. I don't know why they did that.
From 2004 to 2007, these investment banks each significantly increased their financial leverage. This amplified gains, but also amplified losses.
Oh my God.
As they gambled more, these banks became extremely vulnerable to financial shocks. In 2007, they reported $4.1 trillion in debt. That was about 30% of US GDP at the time. The stage was now fully set for a moment that would shake the world. During 2004, as the US economy picked up pace, the US central bank started to increase interest rates. This would set off a chain reaction event because financial institutions had offered up many adjustable rate loans based on low rates. Home buyers would enjoy these low rates for about 2 to 3 years. After this period, the rates would reset to align with the market interest rate. But when you combine rising rates with low-income subprime customers, it was a disaster. Home buyers went from paying little to no monthly interest payments to their payments suddenly snapping up to multiple times higher to meet the market. Many just couldn't pay up.
But after 2, 3, or 5 years, those rates reset. They went up, and so did the monthly payment. So a mortgage of, say, $800 a month could easily jump to $1,500.
By mid-2006, an increasing number of defaults caused home prices to fall. Homes were now worth less than their mortgage loan. Many homeowners stopped paying their mortgages and went into foreclosure. This is where the crisis starts gaining momentum. As more foreclosures occurred, home prices fell further, while demand kept decreasing as well. As 2007 got underway, nearly 1.3 million properties were foreclosed.
1, 2, 3, 4,
There was a
5,
rumbling that
6,
something big
7,
was going
8,
on when the
9,
subprime
10,
specialist
11,
lender,
12,
New Century
13, 14,
Financial,
15,
files for bankruptcy.
17, 18, 19.
One
21,
subprime lender after another.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
By the end of
6, 7,
2007,
8, 9,
2.2 million homes have been foreclosed, and the subprime mortgage crisis is
7,
officially underway.
21, 2, 1, 2,
The high default rates by the homeowners
6,
led to a
7,
rapid devaluation of financially engineered products from before. Investors were now aware of the risks, and they were now trying to sell these toxic debt boxes at all costs. In March of 2007, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke tries to calm the markets. He states the subprime loan issue is contained. He couldn't have been more wrong. Ironically, in October 2022, Ben Bernanke would win the Nobel Prize for Economics. You're about to see why this is so ironic. In August of 2007, a bombshell announcement rattles the market. France's BNP Paribas announces that there is no liquidity in the global market for mortgage-backed securities. In other words, nobody wants to buy the debt boxes anymore. They're essentially worthless. Other European banks follow with similar announcements. The real picture was becoming clear. The mortgage-backed securities that were supposed to be AAA and safe are in reality worthless. And even worse, they had spread through the global financial system undetected like a cancer. As a result of these shock announcements, there was a panic among financial firms and banks. Investors looked around and wanted to pull any funding that was thought to be vulnerable to mortgage losses. Financial institutions struggled to assess the values of their books. What they thought was worth trillions of dollars could actually be worth close to zero. The contagion continued to spread. September 2007. UK bank Northern Rock was also playing with high leverage and financially engineered products, and they have to be bailed out by the Bank of England. Investors then queued to take their money out. It was the first bank run in the UK since 1866. While all of this was going on, the Federal Reserve was still clueless. They forecasted that the slowdown would be mild, stating that there would still be 3% GDP growth. Come on, guys. March of 2008 sees Bear Stearns fall. Bear Stearns was a pillar of Wall Street dating back to 1923 and was the fifth largest investment bank. The firm carried a notional market value of $13.4 trillion. So how did this number get so high? This is because they were also being reckless and using very high leverage, which multiplied their losses. Bear Stearns bet big on the mortgage markets and lost.
Well, the markets have certainly gotten worse, but our liquidity position has not changed at all. Our balance sheet has not weakened at all.
And yet, 48 hours later, everything changes. This morning, Schwartz said that the firm's cash position had deteriorated sharply over the past day. Questions now being asked after the loss of $3.5 billion in market value today alone.
They were bought by JP Morgan for $2 a share. Just earlier in the year, Bear Stearns was worth $170 per share. Global panic ensued, and it was at a fever pitch. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank, is being looked at as the next to fall. It was also heavily exposed to the subprime mortgage financial products. Lehman CFO, Aaron Cohen, calmed investors by boasting of a profit of $489 million. The stock jumps 48% on the news. But all wasn't as it seems. A later 2010 report by the Court Examiner stated that Lehman executives regularly used accounting gimmicks at the end of each quarter to make their financials seem less shaky than they really were. In reality, their risky commercial real estate holdings were 30 times greater than their capital. Lehman Brothers was so highly leveraged that a 3 to 5% decline in real estate values would completely wipe out all of their capital. By June, Lehman Brothers reported a $2.6 million loss, which no amount of accounting magic could hide. Their stock falls by 73%. Meanwhile, other banks such as Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs started betting against the mortgage securities, which they were still selling, and they would make hundreds of millions of dollars, while investors lost everything. Unbelievable. At this time, the US had now tipped into recession as GDP fell by 2.1%. September 2008, the crisis begins to spin out of control, and Lehman Brothers collapses. This marks the largest US bankruptcy of all time.
The U.S. government said it won't bail out Lehman, which last week announced more than $3.9 billion in losses. Shares in Lehman Brothers have plummeted more than 80% in 2008 alone.
Everybody in the West, at least, owns, a lot of people have got pensions, and these pensions are invested in the stock market, and a lot of the shares are actually the shares of banks. And when bank shares get hammered, people's pensions get hammered, so everybody loses.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt after talks to pull them back from the abyss collapsed. And financial markets from Asia to Europe are doing their utmost to prevent Monday from turning from dark to black.
17.
It's going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
I don't think anyone really expected a bank as big as Lehman to be in a position that it's in now.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated. Meanwhile, Merrill Lynch, fearing it could be next, agreed in an act of desperation to a shotgun marriage with Bank of America. So in just 6 months, 3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared. Bear Stearns was collapsed last spring.
The banks were all scared, and they stopped lending to each other, and the financial system froze. Companies couldn't pay parts, pay for staff, and businesses ground to a halt. And if nothing was done, planes would have to stop flying.
We came as close as we have ever come in history to a total cardiac arrest, not just of the American economy, but the entire world economy.
Meaning everybody's afraid to lend to everybody else credit, simply freezes, and an economy, a modern economy, can't function that way?
A modern economy can't function without credit in more than even a couple of hours, frankly seconds. GE, the pillar of American manufacturing, was having a hard time getting short-term credit. So was Harvard University. Wage bills were not being paid.
Knowing that something had to be done, the infamous bailout started. On September 16, 2008, the US Federal Reserve stepped in to buy AIG, the largest insurer in the US. While Lehman was just another bank, AIG presented a systemic risk to the entire financial system, or so they told us. It was an $85 billion loan, and this was the origin of the famous too big to fail argument.
We're in an urgent situation, and the consequences will grow worse each day if we do not act.
The US government gave the banks $700 billion to purchase toxic assets and bank shares to stop them from falling any lower. It did work, but the biggest banks just ended up being even larger after buying up all the other failing banks. The use of hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to bail out these banks sparked complete outrage. It was the beginning of mass distrust in institutions and governments. The immediate result was the Occupy Wall Street movement and the invention of Bitcoin. Bailing out the banks was an unpopular move. But the other option wasn't fun either. The crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression lasted for almost a decade. There's arguments to be made on both sides. As for now, the crisis was still in full swing. The Federal Reserve also cut interest rates in the hope of restoring the market. In total, during the fourth quarter of 2008, the Central Bank of the United States purchased $2.5 trillion of government debt and junk private assets from the banks. Up until that point, this was the largest monetary policy action in the history of the world. By 2009, the stock market has fallen 50% from its 2007 high. Pension funds were completely wiped out.
1, 2, 3. 30%.
As we know, it wasn't just the US that suffered. Institutions and governments around the world owned American assets. In 2008, it became obvious that the crisis was going to have global repercussions. After the fall of Lehman Brothers, banks and corporations globally began to fail. In the UK, HBOS was taken over by Lloyds, and the UK government steps in to save its banking system. With lending markets drying up around the world, the central banks of the United States, European Union, Australia, Canada, and Japan coordinated injecting cash into debt markets for the first time since 9/11. November of 2008 sees the International Monetary Fund approve loans to stabilize Ukraine and Iceland. By December 2008, riots had broken out in Greece.
Today, the clashes were centered around the Greek parliament, one of the few buildings here being adequately protected.
Iceland was hit particularly bad. Relative to the size of its economy, the systemic collapse was the largest experienced by any country in economic history. Some of the biggest banks in the nation became worthless, and their stock market fell by almost 80%.
Here as elsewhere, the police are first to meet the anger and despair amongst the population. During the past weekends, thousands have taken to the streets to protest against their government and alleged corruption amongst bank managers. For the first time in history in this tiny nation, leading politicians and businessmen are now protected by armed guards. Landsbanki was one of 3 big Icelandic banks that had engaged in an uncontrolled loaning spree abroad. When the international credit crunch hit, they had accumulated loans worth 12 times the nation's GDP. When the banks defaulted, the state had to take over their debts, worth more than $60 billion.
Unlike many countries, the people of Iceland actually chased out their bankers and jailed them. Meanwhile, in the United States, the top 5 leading executives walked away with $2 billion, and they got to keep the money. The rest of Europe was still hit hard, the results of which was the European debt crisis, a multi-year economic crisis that took place from 2009 until the end of the 2010s. Some member states, namely Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Ireland, were unable to repay or refinance their government debt. Until today, countries like Greece are still struggling to overcome their financial issues. On April 10, 2009, Time magazine declared, quote, "More quickly than it began, the banking crisis is over." But was it really? Problems still persisted. Wages and incomes continued to languish. The real economy was limping. People would be out of work for a few years to come, and by 2010, unemployment around the world had risen, hitting almost 10% in the United States and Europe. 6 million Americans lost their jobs, and 8 million lost their homes.
Oscar Munoz used to sell real estate. Now his company clears out foreclosed homes.
I wonder, do you ever come to houses where the people are still here? Absolutely. That's really a sad situation. I'd rather not meet the people. Why not? It's not easy to come in and move a family out. It's just our job to do it for the bank. It's just the nature of what's going on in the market.
In 2010, regulatory action was finally taken. The US government passed the Dodd-Frank Act. It included more oversight and transparency for financially engineered products, limits on risky bank investment, tighter regulation for rating agencies. The whole aim was to stop this kind of disaster from ever happening again. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have worked. Today, banks have reinvented the debt boxes and the tools used to speculate on them. This time, they're calling them bespoke collateralized synthetic obligations. This time, they're using corporate debt instead of mortgages. 2022 saw a large spike in activity, quadrupling to $40 billion in this year alone. Let's just hope that corporations don't all default on their debt due to a systemic shock. I personally don't think we'll have another crisis exactly the same as 2008. But safe to say, these stupid financial experiments aren't helping. I really sincerely hope that there's not more of them out there, which we just don't know about. So what happened next? What scars did such a disaster leave on the economy? Well, there's some strong arguments to be made that there has been no real economy since 2008. If you look at the GDP per capita of the real economy of the United States, it never recovered. It has been below trend since 2008. In if you were in your late 30s onwards, this is probably why it felt harder for the average person to get ahead since the crash. In the United States alone, it's projected that an adult that lived through the crash has lost about $70,000 in lifetime earnings. Younger people were less affected, but less employment opportunities still set them back. For the first time, a whole generation will be poorer than their parents. It's not uncommon for younger people to live paycheck to paycheck, funding their lives with buy now, pay later debt. Subsequently, the fertility rates around the world have decreased significantly after 2008. There may be other explanations for the phenomenon, but the charts are clear. A financial disaster would certainly impact the way families would plan for their future. After the 2008 crisis, central banks gained more power. They set interest rates low for so long that the stock market and eventually the whole financial system adjusted and settled around this state. Low interest rates meant cheap money. People, companies, and governments borrowed money with virtually no interest. Investments turned risky, and excessive debt distorted many markets. By the mid-2010s, these conditions had become the scaffolding for the whole financial system. Growth became dependent on central banks keeping these conditions the same. Wealth inequality exploded as those closest to the financial industry got extremely rich, while the rest of the general populace stayed the same. By the late 2010s, many economic commentators were referring to this as the everything bubble. First it was stocks, then it was housing, then it's the debt market now, which controls everything. This next point is key to really understanding the death of the real economy. Economic productivity. This is the measure of how much stuff you get out from the resources that you put in. Since 2008, it's been severely injured. Due to zero interest rates for so long after 2008, the investment that would have gone to productive areas of the economy catapulted into riskier sectors. The real economy just didn't get the capital it needed to innovate and develop and do things more efficiently. Low economic productivity affects real wage growth, living standards, and quality of life. Even former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen called it the, quote, most important factor determining continued advancements in living standards. This is why, when our leaders told us that the economy was booming in the 2010s, it really didn't feel like that to many people. Productivity was gone. It's a missing piece of the 21st century economic story that's often left out. Then we come to 2020, and the pandemic saw central banks respond much quicker with a lot of force, printing trillions of dollars as the economy was slowing to a halt. There's no denying that this mitigated the pain. But was this an overreaction? Many think so. Economic professor Jeremy Seeger called it a monumental mistake. Regardless, the stock market loved it and vaulted to all-time highs. Then, investments into risky assets like NFTs shot up. Eventually, there was too much money in the system and not enough goods, and the prices of everything started to rise. Aside from the fallout of COVID and the war in Ukraine, a component of inflation today comes from the actions of central banks. In the latest stage of this roller coaster, central banks have panicked at the large inflation and have started raising rates. This was to slow down the economy and reduce demand, and this is supposed to bring down inflation. But as stated, low rates and easy money have become the scaffolding of the financial system. Raising interest rates reverses these conditions that the financial system was used to. This is why, as soon as interest rates start rising, everything seems to be falling apart. Stock markets are crashing, and companies are laying off staff. The whole system just isn't used to a normal interest rate environment. Today, there's a lot more debt in the system than in 2008, and this was thanks to central banks keeping interest rates near zero for more than a decade. Increasing rates would make this large volume of debt harder to manage for individuals and governments. Countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK have a lot of variable rate mortgages, which will snap higher to market rates over the next few years. Subprime car loans and credit card loans are seeing increased defaults. Meanwhile, Credit Suisse is in trouble and is selling part of the domestic bank. Central bank liquidity swaps are going crazy in Switzerland, doubling in the past couple of weeks. It looks like we're going to have another recession, but what happens beyond that is anyone's guess. After almost 15 years, the 2008 recession has taught us several lessons. It was the loose lending standards and low central bank interest rates that started the problem. Financial engineering spread it to the world. Bad policy, accounting fraud, and poor credit rating agencies fanned the flames. Although structural reform has taken place since 2008, we should also take a deeper look into central banks and their decisions. They always seem to print and leave rates too low for too long, distorting markets and blowing up bubbles, only to pop these bubbles later. It's a scenario that seems to be playing out again today. All in all, the real lesson that we as a society never seem to learn is to keep those in charge accountable and also to plan for the unpredictable. So, for you personally, what can you do if you're worried and don't trust our expert leaders? The key is to avoid risk. If you're inclined to keep your money safe, think about assets that have little to no risk or financial engineering behind them. Some believe physical gold and silver, as boring as they may seem, are the ultimate riskless assets. Others believe government bonds are. Others still think plain old cash is best. Talk to a financial professional to make that personal decision and to sleep easier at night. So before I finally go, I do want to hear some stories from 2008 from you guys. I know I was too young to be impacted directly, but I did know and I got a sense that the world was changing while I was studying in university. So what do you remember from this period? Anyway, a massive thanks for watching. This episode did take a lot of effort to bring to life, so I do want to thank you for sticking till the end. If you did like it, take a look around the channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff on science, technology, business, and finance. In the next episode, we'll move away from finance for a second and take a look at an interesting story. Did you know that apart from Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Apple had a third co-founder, and he sold 10% of his Apple shares for a measly $800 in 1976? Well, I'll see.
The Praetorian Guard was a famous unit of the Roman Empire, whose reputation evoked mixed feelings of awe, fear, and mystery. In the popular imagination, they are often equated to modern forces such as the elite commandos of the SAS, or the Republican Guard troops, which have propped up dictators such as Saddam Hussein. Even in the historical realm, their role has been subject to doubt, with some in the past perceiving them as a ceremonial unit equipped with archaic armor designed only for show. So, who were they? Special forces, dictatorial muscle men, or ceremonial raids? Let's find out.
You can get your hands on your own Praetorians through today's sponsor, Victrix, creators of historically accurate miniatures spanning all the way from the Greco-Persian Wars to the Napoleonic era.
Let's go, man.
I've
Let's
actually
go.
drooled over these things for a long time now, and when we found out that the Victrix folks were also fans of ours, we had to team up. I mean, just look at these Imperial Legionaries. The 28mm classic models are bursting with detail, which is a testament to Victrix's obsession with historical accuracy and producing the finest historical miniatures on the market. The kit comes with a huge variety of options for poses, armor, weapons, standards, skins, torches, and even severed heads for your soldiers to hold as trophies. With these, you can make officers like a signifer and a or transform the whole lot to look like Praetorians with fantastic, easy-to-use shield design transfer. Best of all, Victrix has created an exclusive deal for our viewers, including Roman legionaries, paints, and shield transfers for a bundle deal that's 20% off. So start building your own Roman legion worthy of fighting for the Empire by clicking the link below or going to victrixlimited.com/invicta. Enjoy.
The tradition of Roman bodyguards dates back to the earliest history of its armed forces. In the very beginning, Roman warfare was quite tribal and primitive in nature. During these days of the early monarchy, it revolved around war bands led by chieftains and their close retinue. As their military evolved, however, the mass of warriors became more organized. During this period, the generals still relied on household troops for protection, but increasingly specific units within the army were assigned this role whilst on campaign. At first, It seems that these would have been Roman citizens. Their selection was particularly important when monarchy turned to republic, and the new government needed to ensure its own safety. Soon, however, the pool of potential bodyguard candidates was expanded. For instance, during the early republic, it became practice for 1/3 of the Allied cavalry and 1/5 of the Allied infantry to be selected as the extraordinary. It was this elite group which took on many critical roles for the army and treated closest to the general command. As a result, their members also came to be tapped to serve alongside the Roman bodyguards. At this point, however, the unit was not yet institutionalized. Rather, it remained a temporary, ad hoc collection of individuals who together accompanied the commander. In the field, these men would have been welcome guests in the general's tent, known as the praetorian. As such, they might be referred to informally as the cohors praetorian. Over the centuries, their composition would naturally have fluctuated. For instance, the General Scipio Aemilianus was famous for selecting 500 men to guard him against enemy sorties during the siege of Numantia, while Julius Caesar grew fond of keeping a band of Germanic cavalrymen close by his side over the course of his campaigns. By the late 1st century BC, it seems that this practice became more regularized, as loyalties began to revolve around powerful men rather than the state. Following the death of Julius Caesar, both Antony and Octavian divided between them 8,000 veterans, many of whom had fought under the dictator. These in turn were formed into multiple cohortes praetorian as a part of either triumvir's own personal praetorian guards. When both men turned on one another, their praetorians became involved in the fighting and, on occasion, faced each other directly. After his victory at Actium in 31 BC, Octavian united his forces with those of his opponent in a symbolic reunification of Julius Caesar's army. This resulted in the existence of 9 praetorian cohorts after the war, fielding a maximum of 5,400 men. Rather than disband these units, Octavian decided to keep them in his service as a peacetime security force. Ever recruited ruler, he was extremely wary of blatantly flaunting his newfound power, and only billeted 3 cohorts around the city of Rome, with the rest scattered throughout Italy. Over the course of his reign, their role would gradually morph to the needs of the new administration. In 2 BC, Octavian, now named Augustus, bureaucratized their structure by appointing 2 praetorian prefects to take overall command of the cohorts, which had previously functioned independently. By the end of his reign, the guard was on its way to becoming enmeshed into the fabric of imperial rule. Now, let us take a closer look at the soldiers who made up the ranks of this praetorian guard. As a military force, the praetorians were heavy infantry, trained and equipped like legionaries. However, some of their gear was considerably more ornate and included Union emblems. Praetorian helmets, for instance, appear to have sported a tall horsehair crest with elaborate details worked into the metal. Shields were similarly well decorated and maintained a rounded shape, as opposed to the increasingly rectangular scutum of the early empire. Each legion had its own emblem displayed on its shield, and the Praetorian Guard were one of only a handful of units known to use the thunderbolt design. Evidence suggests that each Praetorian cohort had its own unique variant. Additionally, wings, stars, and crescents were probably painted on their shield boards, with scorpions featuring prominently as well. Guard units were also unique in that their standard bearers wore lion skin capes as opposed to the bear skin capes of their legionary counterparts. The standards themselves used the image of Victoria, winged goddess of victory, and were so heavily decorated with awards that men reportedly had difficulty carrying them on long marches. The rest of the Victorians' kit matched what the average soldier wore. This might include mail, scale, or the famed lorica segmentata. Swords, daggers, and elae were also standard fare. The key difference between regular and guard units was that the Praetorians were often far removed from the threat of combat. As such, they rarely made full use of their equipment outside of the parade ground. Instead, they could be seen carrying a pilum and shield with tunics, neck scarves, and cloaks rather than armour. Depending on their duties, a guardsman might even wear a toga to reflect civilian garment, but still remain conspicuous in fashion. But how would one become a Praetorian guard in the first place? Records indicate that they were originally legionaries handpicked from among the active units of the army. Under Augustus, their recruiting grounds were strictly restricted to Etruria, Umbria, Latium, and the old legion colonies in Italy. This was eventually expanded to include Spain, Macedonia, and Noricum, which were some of the most prosperous and Romanized parts of the empire. During the reign of Septimius Severus, the doors were opened up to all legionaries, and most recruits came from the provinces. Dio said this made transfer to the Praetorians a kind of prize for those who proved brave in war. To others, this shift eroded the perceived elite nature of the guard. Generally speaking, the men were recruited between the ages of 15 and 32, slightly broader than the typical range of between 18 and 23 for most legionaries. The man would need to be physically fit, of good character, and from a respected family. Letters of recommendation were very important, and proper patronage could have been made yours. Upon being admitted, guardsmen would enjoy several unique benefits related to enlistment and pay. For instance, basic legionaries had a typical 25-year service limit. By contrast, Mark had initially set a 12-year enlistment period as Praetorian Guard, which Augustus raised to 16 years. Over time, this service length would remain less than that of regular troops.